I sometimes wonder what really defines historical political times. I came to KU, enrolled in KU in 1969, and it was in the midst of the Vietnam War and all the problems and hassles and great, cultural upheaval that we were going through there. And now I look at the last few years and I wonder how they really compare. I mean, Brownback has just driven us into a ditch with his plan to just scrap our income tax, which was a third of revenues to our state. And now we have President Trump in the White House. I mean, good heavens. And Trump wants to borrow much of Brownback's tax package, is what they're thinking about for a national tax plan at this point. Guess my next question, is everybody ready for Governor Kobach next year to... Well, the legislature, they have to do a couple things, which are their primary functions, and then there are the secondary issues that they spend a lot of time on. They have to pass a budget, and they have to pass a budget that does not contain a deficit. Now, we play some games, and as you think back of some of the comments off this tape, we've used bonding incredibly for highways and to renovate our capital and a number of things. So we're building and passing debt on for 20, 30 years. We're using debt to dredge John Redmond Reservoir so we can keep Wolf Creek running. So you wonder how that counts against a balanced state annual budget, but that's another thing. And as this presentation showed, we've run through most of the tricks and most of the borrowing and taking, one-time money, and so we had a structural deficit facing us. And this new legislature stepped up to the task to say we've got to reverse course and we've got to rebuild a revenue base at this point. So to get a budget passed and get it semi in balance, you had to deal with passing the tax package, which they did. The other thing that was on the must-do list was brought to us by the Kansas Supreme Court that looked at our 2-year block grant, school funding block grant we've had, and declared it unconstitutional. And basically said, you have to come up with a constitutional plan by July 1 or no money will be let out for public schools starting July 1st. So that was a mandate that this legislature couldn't avoid, and they had to deal with it at this point. So talking about the tax package that did pass, it was in 1994 that Kansas really rebalanced our taxes statewide. Up to that point, we had been much too dependent on property taxes for funding schools and people understood that, and they saw the disparity between poor wealth districts and rich wealth districts and how that was an unequal school funding problem. So around that, they built a new tax package with, Finney started it, Bill Graves really completed it, and the ideal was to get to a third sales tax, a third property tax, and a third income tax. It was the three-legged stool that we would have a balance in our state. That one source, sales tax get hit during a recession, income tax is not as much. There's a resilience to what that tax package would be. We never quite got there, but we got pretty close. So Brownback gets elected in 2010, and his great idea is that there are 10 states in our country that doesn't have an income tax, so why does Kansas have to have an income tax? Of course, you forget things like, Wyoming has coal, and Texas has oil, and Florida has tourism, and there are other sources of revenue that came to those states that really didn't balance for Kansas. So off we went. So in the ensuing years, in this experiment, we've gone through 9 rounds of budget cuts. We've had all sorts of the transfers that were mentioned in this presentation, more debt bonding. So we passed over the governor's veto a second time, a new income tax level. It probably restores maybe 80% of what our income taxes were in 2010 before we started making the changes. 2/3 of the tax loss that Brownback put on us was from changing brackets. So we went from 3 brackets to 2 brackets, and we lowered the top rate that our wealthiest thing were paying. So 70% of those tax bracket changes went to the top 10% of filers in our state. So that was 2/3 of it. The other third was this LLC loophole for 333,000 sole proprietorships, subchapter S's, et cetera. That was a brand new experiment. No state had ever done that in our country, to just drop that, and that was automatic. The income brackets were going to come down over a period of time, but we dropped that. When we finally got, first of all, they thought it was going to be 191,000 filers. It ended up at 333,000 filers. And when we finally got some numbers on who was benefiting from that change, 85% of those that tax savings went to 5% of our filers, the million and up. So we have a new tax law. We're going to bring back deductions for medical expenses and mortgage interest, property taxes, child care and adult care expenses. They're not going to be reintroduced back in to our tax package. And for all the specific details you want to know about that, I'll ask Marcy to get into the nuances, since she sat on the Senate Taxation Committee this year and monitored all this a lot closer than I did. Estimates are that for 2018, we're going to get about $591 million new dollars out of the tax package, and for 2019, it's $631 million. Most people think we lost about $900 million in it from the basic income tax changes that Brownback made. We got no reduction in our sales tax at this point, and that was hiked a percent to help pay for the income taxes thing. We're one of a few states that tax groceries at this point, and we're only second to Mississippi in having the highest sales tax on food in the country. I don't know if that's our model, if we're headed to Mississippi or, at this point. So we have the tax thing passed, so they had to do that so that then we could pass a 2-year budget. And Brownback was the first governor to come in and offer 2-year budgets. Always in the past, it was an annual 1-year budget, and each legislative session would review it and talk about it and fine-tune it. The governor wanted 2 years to talk about this and work, maybe give them more space for other debate in the second year. And as a lobbyist and somebody who watches this, I'm still waiting for that change. I'm wondering, when are we going to take next year? Now, we've already passed a budget for 2019. Are the Ways and Means subcommittees, are the House budget committees, are they now, since the budget's set for 2019, are they going to sit down and go over specifics? What about our water plan? What about foster care? What about child support? Take an issue and really delve into it, because they have extra time this next session. We'll see if it ever plays out that way at this point. In many ways, the state budget is not particularly complicated. 50% of our state budget is K through 12 spending. And I'll get into the school package in a little bit. But just a couple numbers to kind of highlight what we're trying to do to catch up with that. In 2009, our base state aid per pupil was $4,400. Today, our base state aid per pupil is $3,852, about $600 less. The new school package that just passed takes us from $3,852 to $44,006 in 2018 and $4,128 in 2019. So we don't come anywhere close to $4,400 that we were at in 2008. And that doesn't do anything about inflation. What should that $4,400 be, to make up for that? So that's K through 12. The next 20% really comes for social services. And the vast amount of social services that we spend money on in Kansas is our Medicaid program that we call KanCare at this point. The one thing the legislature did do is pass they increased the fees for medical providers in Kansas. And then these increased fees then can be used to draw down more federal Medicaid dollars. So last year, to get out of the mess we had with the budget, we cut Medicaid providers by 4%. And this increase in fees is going to at least make up for that 4% cut. I could spend more time on some of the other social service issues. We have a record number of kids in foster care at this point, about 7,600 kids. They passed to finally they're going to develop a new task force to look at how our foster care system's doing. We were the first state in the country in 1997 to privatize totally our foster care system. And I think it's real hard for anybody to say that we've made vast improvements going in that direction. I would say a sidelight to that is many of you are familiar with the temporary assistance for needy families, which is our basic public assistance program in Kansas. When Brownback started, we had 38,000 people on that program. Today we have 13,000. And out of the 25,000 people that have lost TANF services, 2/3 of those are children. And I think the logical connection is, we dropped that many kids off TANF, how many of those bled into the foster care system at this point? We could do that. We could check Social Security numbers at this point. The other social service area that I could come back to in questions is child support. Kansas decided that we were going to be the first in the country to basically privatize our child support system. And we're finally starting to get a little numbers. Current monthly child support collections in Kansas is at 54%. So only 50% of current monthly support is being paid. The national average is 65%. And child support is so vital, it touches 233,000 Kansas children, which is roughly 1/3 of the children in our state are caught up in the child support system. The next on the list is higher education, and I don't need to come to Lawrence to talk about what's happened to KU and spending on that. We've basically lost 25 to 30% of state support for higher education and recouped a lot of it in higher tuition at this point. KU and K-State got a little bit help this session because they were cut even more than the other Regents universities were last year, so that. The other 15% of our budget goes for a lot of things, but a few of them, Osawatomie is just in desperate straits at this point. We can't get it recertified by the federal Medicare folks. We're losing $1 million a month at that point. Staffing 1/3 of the positions at Osawatomie are vacant. I mean, it's a mess. And when you have no money and no way to fix these problems, then it continues to steamroll. Another issue that's getting a little play that we're going to see over this summer is, are we going to bring some new entity in to build a new prison at Lansing? Lansing's our largest prison in Kansas. It was built in the 1870s, not long after Abe Lincoln at this point, and it's in pretty desperate straits. And the question is, can we bring an entity in to build it and we lease it from it for a period of time, and then does Kansas take ownership after that? And that's another issue I'm sure Marcy could fill in at this point. The other social service debate that went on that wasn't successful was expanding the Medicaid program in Kansas. They got it through the legislature, and once again, it was vetoed by the governor. It would pick up between 150 and 180,000 Kansans who are uninsured at this point, and it would bring desperate relief to a lot of the hospitals in our state. We have about 90 of them, and the estimates are that 30 of them are in pretty serious financial straits at this point, with 2 or 3 about ready to close in any week. School funding formula. So we're going to see what the Kansas Supreme Court has to say about that. The bill that the legislature passed is sitting on the governor's desk. Would he veto it? It seems unlikely. Most political observers don't think that the governor will do that. But But as soon as it's signed, then sometime next week there'll be a hearing before the Kansas Supreme Court to see how close Kansas came to fixing this mess and getting a constitutional system in place. You know, I think, basically what we did is we reversed course, threw out the block grant, took the old school funding formula and tweaked it in some specific ways. The Supreme Court is particularly interested in the fact that 25% of our public schools, 25% of public students are underperforming, seriously underperforming. And so the Supreme Court wanted a better focus out of a new school funding formula to help with that 25%. So that's kind of the equity question. And I think most people, most people believe that they've solved that problem, that there's enough focus on at-risk funding, and to help, you know, and the state board is going to identify particular programs that will help with at-risk programs, that the money will really go to the kids who are there. The other question is adequacy. And I gave you the numbers before, 4,400, 3,852, we only get back to 4,000, 4,100, we got a ways to go. Our State Board of Education, elected body, you know, in our state, came in at the first of the session and said, how much money do we need in 2 years to make up the problems we've had over the last several years? Their number was $885 million. This bill that was passed, that's sitting on the governor's desk, is $300 million. So is that enough? Will the court look and say, well, you're trying hard, 18, you know, it's a start, you're going to be back next January, maybe you can up that a little more. You know, we're going to see what the court has to say about it. Last thing I would say is that there is some expansion of using state dollars for private schools. And in the school funding block grant bill that was passed, they allowed corporations to get a tax break to send kids to a parochial school or a home school. And the vast amount of it went to Catholic schools in the state. This bill opens it up from not just corporations, but individuals can ask for tax credits for making a contribution. It's capped at $10 million. And I think over the last couple years, it's been used at about 2 million of the 10 million. Once again, if we get into more of those details than that, we'll have Marcy sort all that out. I want to go into some other issues that I think are pretty important, and unfortunately, as this advocate, I don't see debated very much, and I'm wondering how we can get it refocused. Top on my list would be affordable housing in the state of Kansas. That affects seniors, the mentally ill, you know, renters, you know. We don't have a discussion really on what's happening with affordable housing. Under Bill Graves, he had a top-level task force of cabinet members that really looked at all this stuff. And Kansas really compiled detailed numbers by county. How many disabled units do you need? How many elderly? How many, you know, it was very great data that we don't do anymore at this point. We don't have a successful first-time home buyer loan program that the federal government helps out with bonding to do it. We run it through counties. I know this is a little getting into the weeds too much, but basically we don't have a thrust from Topeka to really help with first-time home buyer loans. We have 1.2 million housing units in the state of Kansas. 2/3 are owner-occupied, 1/3 are rentals. So we have about 400,000 rental units in Kansas, and 40% of our renters pay over 35 up to 70% of their income for housing. They're extremely cost burdened. And we need a discussion about that. The Kansas Health Institute did an analysis in November of 2015 and basically said that 1 out of 6 Kansas households are food insecure in our state. that we have 1 out of 6 of our households, people have questions whether they have enough food at the end of the month. And the connection we've never really made is what are these housing costs doing to the problem for people to be able to feed themselves. I want to talk about utilities here a little bit. I think we're really at a crossroads in a kind of fundamental way what's going to happen with utilities. And most of this is happening before our Kansas Corporation Commission, which is the entity that regulates our investor-owned utilities, the large ones. The KCP&L, the Westars, the Kansas Gas Services, you know, the major players that provide utilities. They've got 3 dockets before them, and we're going to see kind of the results of that and what that does for future energy policy. First docket is Kansas City Power and Light, which is owned by Great Plains Energy, wants to buy Westar, our largest electric utility. They held hearings on it. The Corporation Commission looked at it and said it's too expensive and it wouldn't be good for ratepayers. Well, Westar wants to sell. And when I talk to journalists and people about it, a lot of them say there are a lot of executives at Westar who want to unload their stock and they want to get out of the game. So the question is, who's going to buy Westar going forward? Will KCP&L come back in with another bid? Here's my radical approach. Why do we need an investor-owned? Why should our largest electric utility be investor-owned in Kansas? If you go to our socialist neighbor to the north called Nebraska, they do not have an investor-owned utility in their whole state. So we've got 29 rural electric co-ops. We've got some large municipals like the BPU in Kansas City, Kansas that has 120,000 customers. Why can't our RECs and municipals get together and buy Westar? And why does 8 to 10% of the profits of a major investor-owned utility like Westar have to go to Boston or to New York or to London or wherever? Why can't we keep that money here? Second docket that's probably as important is what's going to happen with energy efficiency in the state of Kansas. Kansas has been 45th of the 50 states of having conservation programs available, either utility run or government run. We've been almost dead last in that. Kansas City Power and Light passed a bill 2 years ago to tell the Corporation Commission, we want to bring some of these conservation programs to Kansas. Now the question is, how do we get paid for it? And really what it comes down to is, we're all in this together. I mean, you're captive customers of the utility that you have to buy from. So if Kansas City Power and Light wants to run energy conservation programs in Kansas, should only the customers that get insulated or get a new appliances or that, should they be the only ones that are paying for it? Or since we're all in it together, why don't we figure out a way, because it's the cheapest option to provide electricity is saving it than it is with a coal or wind or any other choice. So that docket is before the KCC and whether they're going to come up with a way to rate base it and assess all customers for some of these programs and how that's going to work. And, you know, is KCP&L pissed off at the Corporation Commission getting turned down for buying Westar? Are they going to back off? The third important data or docket is really what they call distributed energy. And it gets down to a question of solar and wind systems. And Cromwell and every people, you know, the push is really on to add solar panels to more and more homes to figure out ways to finance it. Margaret knows that as well as anybody. So the question for the Corporation Commission is, I have a solar panel on my house and I don't have battery backups, and I'm using the electric grid behind me as my battery backup. What is a fair monthly charge for that service? And then secondly, probably, which gets maybe more, needs to be debated, is the solar panels produce electricity at the peak time for our electric utilities. We're a summer peaking electric state. Our greatest demand, and it's primarily driven by air conditioning, and solar panels really meet that demand almost perfectly. So then the question is, if I'm generating more power off my solar panels at the heat of the day and sending it back to Westar or whoever, what's a fair price for me to get for that power? What the utilities want to do is you pay retail, 12 to 14 cents a kilowatt hour. They want to pay you wholesale, or fuel avoidance, which is maybe 3 to 5 cents a kilowatt hour. So the question is, because if you gave solar operators what is true net metering, they pay retail, they can sell back for retail, then the payment plans for those solar panels would be dramatically reduced. On to agriculture here a little bit. We worked on local foods issues in Kansas for the last couple years. We had a state task force. You know, I guess what we're really trying to figure out is where to go from here at this point. We import 95% of the fruits and vegetables that you eat in your household comes from out of state at this point. It's about $770 million a year we all spend on fruits and vegetables. We only grow 32 million of that locally. So if we could get that to 100 or 200 million, how much more of those dollars would be circulating? When you look at the USDA food plate, half of that food plate is fruits and vegetables. A quarter is protein and a quarter is grains. Only 15% of Kansans come anywhere close to getting their 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. We just became the 7th highest state in the country for adult obesity. 34% of our adults in Kansas are obese, not overweight, obese at this point, anyway. There are some good news about some of this debate. Douglas County was the first county in the state to develop a local food policy council, and they've done some exciting stuff. And Lawrence has 9 community gardens around the thing, and they're developing a food hub, and it's tremendous, you know, the awareness that's happened out of Douglas County. We now have 31 counties in the state that have passed food councils. So whether, you know, the reality is that Topeka doesn't do much with agricultural policy. That the thing that drives agriculture policy way more than anything else is federal legislation, and it's primarily the Farm Bill. And our problem, and we're going to have a Farm Bill debate next year. They have to reauthorize it in 2018. Our Farm Bills subsidize 5 crops: wheat, corn, soybeans, rice, and cotton. That's where the money goes for crop insurance and for loan payments. We don't do anything for fruits and vegetables, even though that's half of the USDA food plate at this point. How many have heard the name JBS? Does that ring a bell with anybody in this room? Happens to be the largest beef packer in the world at this point. Happens to be Brazilian. It bought IBP. It just paid billions of dollars in fines for corruption in the state of Brazil. And they're one of 4 companies that control 90% of our beef trade in our country. I'm sure everybody's heard of Smithfield Farms. That was the largest US-owned pork producer in our country, and it just got bought by the Chinese. I mean, should we care? I mean, food sovereignty, safety, you know, I mean, going forward, I think what we're going to have to do is start talking about how do we redevelop a regional infrastructure again for supplying and producing our own safe and sustainable, hopefully organic food in this country. There's a bill, I didn't know if Jerry Joseph was going to be here today, but we had a bill the last 2 years to do away with conservation easements in the state of Kansas. That county commissions could say, we have too many conservation easements in our county, we're going to put a limit on it. And the bill said that if a new owner buys a piece of property that has a conservation easement on it, they can throw it out. So that hasn't gone anywhere. Good news. We're in the middle of a debate about noxious weeds and pesticide law in the state of Kansas. That's something else Marcy could talk about and her position on ag. And I won't go too far into the weeds on all of this. The simple truth is that for 20 years we've overused Roundup Ready herbicides, glyphosate, and now we have 24 to 30 super weeds in our state and growing. And now the next game is what's the next level of toxicity in our chemical onslaught in agriculture to control that. And what USDA is proposing, what the debate in Kansas is, it will be primarily 2,4-D. And glyphosate is bad enough, but it doesn't drift too much. 2,4-D is another game. And it can drift a ways. And in our existing law, we have no definition of drift for pesticides. We have no right of a landowner to post their land as a no-spray zone. And I think we would have real problems. The county weed departments really enforce pesticide law. They're the main players. And I think their ability to spray right-of-ways and ditches and that, if it gets away from them, well, that's too bad, but I don't know how liable they would be. The other thing in agriculture that is probably pretty key is what's happening with our state water plan. And tell me if you've heard this plan before. It was passed in 1989, and we were going to have a three-legged stool to support our state water plan. A third was going to come from water fees. A third was going to come from agricultural fees, pesticides, fertilizer, and a third was going to come from our state government, state taxpayers. That was the balance. Since 2009, we have stopped with the state tax money going into the water plan. We hit about $28 million, was kind of the average amount in the water plan for 15 years. Next year it'll be 13 million. And our problems are that our reservoirs are filling up. Kansas didn't have a great place to build federal reservoirs, but they're filling up, and that's the backup, that's the supply source for drinking water for most of the urban residents in our state. And so it's tens of millions of dollars to start talking about dredging reservoirs. And we're going to have to face that. The other reality is aquifer depletion, and the Ogallala particularly. Our state issued too many water rights, 35,000. We are over pumping the Ogallala. So then the question is, we made a mistake as a state to issue so many water rights. That water is owned by the people of Kansas. How do we put the genie back in the bottle? And what people are saying is, my water right is equal to my property right. Now that's never been litigated in Kansas courts, and that would be a battle. Because if it is a property right, then we have to buy it back. So we have to buy those water rights back from those people, millions of dollars involved in that. I'm getting close to my end. It's dangerous to give a lobbyist a microphone here, but so let's talk about gun laws. You haven't heard about gun laws, have you? And as we sit, if I have this right, the gun law that was passed by the state legislature is sitting on the governor's desk. A governor has 10 days to sign it, veto it, or let it become law without his signature. Today's the 10th day. And a lot of people are speculating he's probably going to let it become law without his signature. I mean, if he vetoes it, we've got to come up with $12 million, hire 190 people at our 4 state hospitals to provide some protection. 12 million, we have or don't have at this point. Another damaging thing I think from Brownback that we're going to dig out of for a long, long time is how we've treated state employees. And when Brownback took over, there was about 43,000 state employees. We have 36,000 now. Even more decimating than the fact that we cut, and a lot of those positions weren't filled because those agencies didn't have the money to hire those people. Those people were needed. There were social workers and prison guards, and you know, go down a long list. But these agencies were never funded, and especially after the recession hit in 2008 and 9. So this legislature just whacked away at vacant positions, not because nobody said we didn't need them, but we couldn't afford to fill them, so we killed them. I think more troubling beyond that is the threat we've done to classified positions in Kansas. That classified employees had some protection, that they had some place to go to talk about why were they fired, were they mishandled, you know, how were they treated. And what last few years, we have just continually done away. We've done everything we can to make all those new positions unclassified. And one of the games and the way they did it in this was, and you take the Kansas Corporation Commission that had 300 employees, they basically said to the KCC employees, we'll give you a 7% rate increase or wage increase that they hadn't had in a few years, but you have to give up your classification standing. And that wasn't the only agency that we did that in, you know. I mean, it was an effort to kill, you know, kill public service. Lastly, obviously, politics in 2018. Here we go. As I said, everybody ready for Kobach, and what will he do in a low turnout Republican primary in August of 2018? Ed O'Malley's probably going to be in the game. He's a former Johnson County legislature, runs a thing called the Kansas Leadership Council down in Wichita. He would be kind of a moderate option at this point. And then on the Democratic side, we've already seen Josh Savati get into it. He was a state legislator from Ellsworth for a long time, became the Secretary of Agriculture, went on to the EPA, worked under Carl Brooks, who was a great person. And also Carl Brewer, who is the mayor of Wichita, at this point was the first to jump in to the race. And now the question is, are we going to see Jim Ward, who's the House Minority Leader, make the plunge? It's kind of what we're looking for at this point. Looks like Senator Wagle, our president of the Kansas Senate, is probably going to make a jump to run against Estes in the primary in Wichita for that congressional seat that Estes just won but has to rerun in 2018. And the other question from the Senate side is Karen Tyson going to jump into the Republican side on the 2nd Congressional District and see how that works out against, you know, probably a head-to-head battle with Paul Davis in that race. So we could get into some election laws and things, you know. Obviously, I work for the league. I probably should cover those better than I did. I saw where Illinois passed a law recently. It's amazing for Illinois. You talk about a state, they haven't had a budget in 2 years. They have a whole Democratic legislature, and they had a maverick Republican elected as governor, and they haven't done anything. But they just passed a law that said when you register, when you get your vehicle registration, you're also registering to vote at the same time. So,
where is that?
In Illinois, state of Illinois. So with that diatribe and editorial comments, maybe I should give Marcy a couple times to fill in and answer a couple of my miscues, but I'd be glad to answer what questions that I could at this point. You want to make a couple comments?